it's delayed because it's first module, first part one, first meeting, so we have some technical stuff to manage, but I think we have a very long afternoon, so I think we can start waiting the last people to connect to the meetings. So I welcome you. I'm Alberto Soda, I'm president of HELCA and Luce and Veneto, the two clusters that are part with SICAT, Cluster Lumiere, and BISAP to in this project. And we are to start one very thrilling and interesting part of this project, that is the digital training on public procurement in the US and Canada. I think in this project, we are talking of the extra light that is bolstering European lighting clusters, SMEs participation in public procurement, extra UA. I think somebody is moving my slides. I don't know. Okay, so I just give some information about what we are running today. That is our first module of this training, and about this project. It is co-founded by the Procurement program of the European Union. Okay, so in the next slide, we have in these trainings, we have 48 hours. And we are going to run 3 different modules. Modules 1 is public procurement in the USA and Canada, general features. And we have 2 parts for US and 2 parts for Canada. And today we start with the general feature on Canadian market. Module 2 is on public procurement USA and Canada, eligibility requirement assessment criteria. And we have 4 lessons on this module. And finally, we have the module 3 with meet the buyer and build partnership and know the competitors, where we have 4 lessons on this module. So is, I think, 38 hours, very interesting about what we can learn about public procurement in this market. And I really hope that it will be a digital training of interest for sure cluster managers and to the old companies that want to know new information about this market, especially the public procurement. Now I ask Antonella, that is cluster manager of Luce and Veneto, that was involved in managing this training, to give an insight about the modules of today and of second part in 2 days that we have on the Canadian market. And in this slide that you already received, you have the total program of module 1, 2, 3 with the 4 lessons for each module. We have already a schedule for all the lessons, and maybe we can some sheet related maybe to problems. So it was the case for our first lesson today, but for sure we keep you informed about any changing during the digital training that we are starting today. So thank you very much to all cluster to be here, and to the companies that want to attend the lesson today and the lesson in future. I think it could be very interesting to focus on Canadian and American market about public procurement, and really enjoy all the lesson. So please, Antonelli, want to introduce today lesson and module, please.
So thank you, Alberto. So this is the total calendar from 25 of October, so from today to February. So we will have many meetings, many lessons that we can participate in. So today we start with the expert, our expert from Canada, Jan Yadis, and I let him introduce yourself after. We start with this first module, part 1, because we will have also on Tuesday the second part with Jonathan Herbert, so the second expert. And in this first lesson, we will talk about introduction on the Canadian business environment, different level of government and their competencies, best practice, and value proposition. Canada is how to incorporate in Canada, intercultural challenges, and an overview of the public tender organization. So Jan knows very well that the attendees of these training course companies, SMEs from the lighting and furniture sector. So the lesson will be very practical, very focused on our needs. This is the attendees of today. We will have the 4 clusters that are partners of this project. For sure, ELCA with the coordinator of the project, Marta Carcoyet, Alberto Sotta as president of ELCA and Vice Veneto, and one company because this ELCA is also 5 clusters that are members of ELCA, so we have a company from Poland. There is me as Vice Veneto with 3 companies, Multiforme, Savi, and L-System. We have François Bonnet, Marc Antoine, and Hadid from Place Lumière with 3 companies, GL Levin, Comatelec, and Woodlight. From France, and after we have from Barcelona, from Spain, Spicat, with Jordi Ortiz, CEO of Securities, Marisol Esteban, project manager, and 2 other companies, so DCTC Data Control and SECOM. And the last one is the Austrian cluster, DIC, with Katrin Klingfolk and Anna Estermann that I see in our videos. So I let the floor to Jan to introduce himself and the lesson. Enjoy the lesson. Thank you.
Thank you, Antonella, and good morning, everybody. Antonella, if you can give me the hand so I can share my screen.
Okay, you have the screen.
Yeah, I still see your screen, or I still see someone's screen. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so good morning, everybody, and thank you for connecting. And again, I'm sorry I had to cancel last week, but I was pretty sick, and I'm still pretty sick today. So I'm sorry if I'm not 100%. I'll do my best, but I probably have to take a couple of breaks. So sorry in advance for that. So let me share my screen and start the presentation. All right, so I think you can see my screen now.
Yes, we can.
Yes, yes.
There. Okay, so today's agenda, so very quickly I'll introduce myself. We'll talk about part 1 and part 2. And I think that was kind of covered already, the agenda of part 1. But again, want to talk about Canada and how large of a country it is, and all the implication it has for European companies. The role of CETA in the public tender, how to do business in Canada, and I'll try to cover as much as possible the best practices. And then I will have a quick overview of the construction industry, and then we'll have some Q&A. We have a pretty small group today, so please feel free as much as you want to ask questions. You can either ask questions in the chat, or you can just ask questions as we go. I'll try to give you some time to ask questions at the end of the different parts. But please, 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 for it to be interesting and to be more entertaining, feel free to contact. I think when I'm going to when I'm sharing, I don't know if I see all the questions in the chat. So please, maybe Antonella, if you see question coming in, if you could please let me know and ask the question on the behalf of everybody.
Okay, perfect.
That'd be great. So just a few words about who we are. So again, my name is Yann. I'm a dual citizen, originally from France and in Canada since 2003 as a permanent resident, and I became a Canadian citizen in 2006. I lived in Montreal up to 2009, and I moved to Toronto since then. So my company, I founded in 2006. The name of the company is Adexia. We are two partners. My partner, Frederic, is in Montreal, and I myself, again, here in Toronto. So what we've been doing for the past 16 years is to support European companies who have a project to develop in Canada. And we help them at several levels, from everything related to market study, strategic analysis, to finding the right partners. We help with all the incorporation process. We help with human resources, and we also work a lot on different M&A projects. So when we work with a cluster, we've developed a specific offer named Parcours, as you see here. And basically, the idea is to help the cluster and their members to come to Canada. And so we have basically 3 stages: the preparation, and I will consider it's what we're doing today. At least it's part of it. The mission, which is coming in Canada and to meet with the different partners. And finally, and I think very, very importantly, the consolidation, which is when you've done all that nice work, how you transform that work into business. So that's what we're trying to do and to offer. So as I mentioned, the preparation includes some webinars, kickoff meeting, different type of services. The mission, we have different type: individual, collective, hybrid. As I say, the consolidation will try to get you not only in touch, but working with your clients and partner, doing some M&A, business development, and incorporating when needed. But I insist on that part because you will see during today and the next few presentations that being part of the Canadian environment is a way to win some ground when it's time to answer some tenders. All right, so that first module has 2 parts: the part we're covering today and the part we're covering on Thursday. As much as what I'm going to say today is probably interesting, I think what you really need to be part of, and maybe Antonella and all the other cluster manager, I think that will be great for you to maybe make a push to have as many companies as possible coming on Thursday. Jonathan Hébert will be presenting all the federal system. So not only the platform, but tell us a lot about how federal public tenders are put together. So I really, really encourage you to bring as many companies as you can on Thursday, because that's, if there is one module to attend, it will be this one, okay? I'm not saying that what I'm going to say today is not interesting, but but the one on Thursday is the
Will
one
be more
that
practical. Will be more practical. I mean.
yeah, and you know, it's going to be someone that does that every day. It's his job to help with procurement for all the federal agencies. So yeah, don't miss it. So let's start with a quick presentation of Canada. And as I always mention, I always start my presentation about Canada with a map. I think it's very important coming from Europe to understand a little bit better what we're talking about here when we talk about Canada. So the very first thing is definitively the size of the country. So from Halifax, which is here in Nova Scotia, to Vancouver, which is here in British Columbia, it's about 4,500 kilometers, okay? So it's a very wide countries. We have 4.5 different time zones. So half a zone, half an hour difference for the Newfoundland and Labrador, and then you have 1 hour difference between Halifax and Quebec, and then to Quebec to Ontario it's one zone, to Winnipeg to Regina it's another zone, Alberta is one zone, and British Columbia is another zone. So 4.5 hours, meaning that when you are based in Europe, when you work with Montreal or Toronto, you have 6 hours difference. When you work with Vancouver, you have 9 hours difference. It makes it sometimes challenging, and at least when you do some business development, it's always a real challenge to be able to contact people. And even from us, from Toronto, Montreal to Vancouver, 3 hours difference means that, you know, when I want to talk to someone and I want to catch them in the morning, I need to make sure I call early afternoon for me. It is, you know, it's not a huge barrier, but it's here and it exists. The other thing that's very, very important, and you need to put that in your mind right now, because public tenders are going to be organized around that information. Canada is a federal country composed of 10 different provinces and 3 territories. So just for ease of language, I'm going to talk about provinces, but please understand that when I say province, I mean province plus territories. So the territories are the 3 territories here at the very north of Canada, very little population, very harsh climate, mainly composed of First Nation communities, and I will get back on that later. As far as the province, Quebec and Ontario are the 2 main provinces in terms of population, followed by British Columbia and then Alberta. In terms of languages, or at least terms that we use, typically in Canada, we call those provinces, which are Newfoundland and Labrador, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, we call that Atlantic Canada. Okay, so when people refer to Atlantic Canada, we're referring to those 4 provinces right here. And then we have obviously Quebec, and we'll talk about it a bit further, but which has a specificity of not only speaking French, but having passed a lot of laws recently that not only push, but make the use of French mandatory. And so therefore, when you answer some different tenders, that will be something to have in mind. Then you have Ontario, which is today by far the largest province in terms of population and in terms of economical activity. And then you have what we refer as prairies, so Manitoba and Saskatchewan, which are mainly agricultural, very flat, and you can find about every type of cereal agriculture you can imagine. And then you have Alberta, and in the north of Alberta here you have Fort McMurray. Alberta is, as you may know, and that region of Fort McMurray very well known for oil sands. So that's where all the oil production in Canada. And finally, British Columbia with Vancouver, which is where we have all the nice mountains and great for skiing for the one of you who enjoy that. All right, in terms of main cities, the cities you have to know and have in mind when we talk about Canada. So it's Halifax, which is right here, Quebec City and Montreal, Ottawa. So Ottawa is the economic capital of Canada. Toronto, and then we have Winnipeg, Regina, Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver. Okay. So again, and I'm not sure I mentioned it, it's a very big country, but it's only 38 million inhabitants. And those 38 million inhabitants, you have 14 million in Ontario and almost 9 million in Quebec. So that's why we're going to focus a lot in those presentations in Quebec, in Ontario, because you have 3/4 of the population of Canada in those two regions. The last thing I want to mention is that even if the country is very large and very big, please keep in mind that 80%, and actually it's even a bit over that, I think it's 82% of the population in Canada is urbanized. Okay, so live in or around the big cities, and about the same proportion of the population lives within 300 kilometers from the US border. So if you go 300 kilometers up here and you make a line, you're going to have over 80% of the population that concentrated in that little area here. Okay, so that's things to understand as well. Maybe you have already some question on that first slide. No, so I will move on. So now what I think is the most important slide today is to understand how Canada is organized politically with 3 levels of governments. So you have the federal government, the provincial government, and the municipal government. So why is that very important? Because all the public tenders are managed at either the federal level, if we're talking about competencies or power that are under the federal government. Same for provincial and municipal are actually have powers that are dedicated to them coming from the provincial level. So if we go into a little bit more details on that, and for you to understand, so typically the federal government's powers are everything related to national defense, foreign affairs, some industries, and that will be banking, post office, fisheries, shipping, railways, telephone and pipelines. Interesting enough, that's where we have typically the least players. We have some very large players, and that's where we pay a lot of money in Canada. And then the taxes, criminal law, employment insurance, and indigenous land and rights. I just want to stop on that for 1 second. In Canada, it has always been, but especially the past 4 or 5 years, I will say, everything related to indigenous and First Nation communities, it became very, very big. There was a few scandals in Canada. They discovered what they call border schools, where a lot of First Nation kids were brought to school, maltreated. A lot of them died in school. And the whole process was to try to convert them from their Indian tradition to Catholic Western tradition. And that has been very difficult for those communities, and it's now being recognized by the federal government. And so there are a lot of projects when you talk about infrastructures where First Nation communities are being involved as much as possible. And you have to keep that in mind, because on some projects, you will have to not only deal with, but work with those communities to make it work. If I jump now to the powers of the provinces, so I will say the main one that you have to keep in mind is that hospitals, so health and education are under the provincial powers. So everything related to health and education will be linked to the provincial province, as well as everything related to municipalities. Municipalities, again, they have a power which is given to them by the province. Incorporation of companies, but I will get back on that later. Agriculture and immigration are two powers that are actually shared between the federal and the provincial. And so when you try to come to Canada and to immigrate to Canada, or to come for a business working permit, you may have, or no, you don't, it's not may, you have different rules depending on the province in which you land. So typically you're going to have a framework around immigration at the federal level, but then each province will have their particularities. If I take the example of Quebec, if you don't speak French at the moment, it's very, very, very complicated to be able to immigrate to Quebec. They will put a lot of points in their system towards the French-speaking people.
Jan, can I ask you a question?
Yes, definitely.
Because you listed here like the government provincial powers. Is it translated also to the ownership of, let's say, like the example, for example, the buildings that host the post office or the railway station? So the infrastructure. So for example, the railway infrastructure, not only the service, is also up to the federal government, or the street lighting, when you see the powers of the provinces in the municipalities, it's up to the province or it's up to the municipality itself? How does it work? So how it's translated, let's say the ownership and the responsibilities regarding some specific infrastructure in relation to the powers that they have on the services that they're erogating.
Yeah. No, yes, thank you, Marta. It's a great point. So the short answer is yes, meaning that, for example, if we look at, so before I fully answer, you have to understand that within the government, you have different agencies, and you have what we call the crown companies. So crown companies are companies that work like a private companies, but are owned by the government. Okay, so when we say crown, it means it's a federal run company. So for example, the post office, for example, CPCN, which are the railways companies. So therefore, all the building that belongs to those companies or to those agencies or to the federal government belongs to the federal government and are run and operated by the federal government. And then when we're going to see the different public tender, that's where you will see that, let's say there is the building for Post Canada that needs new lighting. The tender will be carried by the federal government, by their agency named Procurement Assistance Canada. And that agency carries all the public tender for all the agency and crown corporations that are under the federal government. Now, when it comes to street lighting, where it's interesting is that, and for roads and streets, you have typically three labels. Some of the roads that are here to connect one province to the next are run by the federal government. The highways that are here to connect cities to city within a province are under the provincial government, and the streets that are in a city are under the municipal government. So the answer is pretty much the same, depending if your street, road, or highway belongs to the federal, provincial, or municipal level. The responsibility of buying, running, operating, maintaining will be under that level of government.
Okay, clear. Thank you.
Actually, just as a kind of a fun example, during the winter, you know, we get some snow here in Canada, and sometimes you will have 2 or 3 streets that have been cleared, and there is no more snow, and someone came to clean the street, and the next street it's full of snow, because that next street is run by, let's say, the provincial government, and they have a different contractor, and the contractor didn't show up yet. So you have like 3 streets with no snow and 1 street full of snow. It's just because it's a different contract, because it's a different level of government. So I fully answer your question, Marta?
Yes, exactly. So this is some common point also with most of the European countries. The responsibilities are very, let's say, chopped around the boundaries. But my curiosity was mainly for the federal government powers, and also this, let's say, the in-house federal companies, if they also own the infrastructure that they manage. So,
sorry. I've already covered most of that slide, but I just want you to have a quick look at the numbers here. So I mentioned Ontario and Quebec. It's almost 25 million people out of the 38, and then you have an idea of the size of the other one. So if you have to focus on part of Canada only, I think the first 4 ones are probably the most interesting. But this being said, if you're in the agriculture world, Manitoba and Saskatchewan will be the place to be. In terms of cities, I mentioned the cities, but here again, to give you a sense of the size. So Toronto, so we have what we call the GTA, which is the Greater Toronto Area, which is Toronto and the close suburbs. So Toronto and suburbs is a bit over 6 million people. Population and languages. So I think it's very interesting to understand that Canada has been built around immigration and is still being built around immigration. All the growth in population in Canada that we are experiencing right now is only due to immigration. If we had no immigration, we'll be losing population every year. So understand that Canada has been and is being built on immigration, which create a lot of different communities from all around the world. The first communities were a lot from Eastern Europe. I'm living in a city named Mississauga, which is just next to Toronto. And Mississauga, we have about 900,000 inhabitants. Over those 900 to 2,000, there is at least 200,000 people who are coming or originally from Poland. So it just gives you a sense of the strength of the community in Canada. In terms of languages, we have 2 official languages, and that's something that you really need to understand and to take a note of, because as soon as you answer to any federal tender, you need to have available all the materials that you will provide available both in English and French. Meaning that if you sell some equipment, for example, and there is some notice of utilization, it has to be both in French and English. If you provide some service that require training, you will have to be able your training both in French and English. you will not be able to do just one. Now, when we go to Quebec, and I started to talk about it before, in Quebec, they just put in place the Charte de la langue française, which is kind of a law that's above all the other laws, and that will make it mandatory to have, every time it's possible, French solution adopted by governments and companies. So let's say you have a software and a company in Quebec buys the software, and that software is in English only. The interface is in English only. If someone in the company complains and say, I don't want to work with a software in English, and can demonstrate that there is an equivalent software available in French, the company will have to switch from that English to the French software. So when you answer to tenders in Canada, be ready at the federal level, be ready for 2 languages. If you're answering to any provinces in Canada but Quebec, you can probably get away with English only. If it's in Quebec, you can probably get away with French only, but it is highly recommended that anything you do, you get ready to do it in both languages.
So Jan, also the documentation issued by the public authorities or federal are bilingual, are in both languages, like the tender documents.
Yes, typically the tenders at the federal level are in both languages most of the time. You have some exception. We'll go back on that later, but the federal government is also sharing that some tenders that are actually at the provincial level, and those one might be or are typically in one language only. Sorry about that. Climate. It seems to be a little details, but it's we have to talk about it, especially in your guys' industry where you're in the lighting and the electronic system, where if you have any equipment that's outside, that equipment needs to be ready to go through winter, meaning that typically in any public tenders with application outside, there will be a requirement for your electronic device or components to be able to sustain a temperature between -40 and +40. That will be typically the range that's required. If you're not able to provide such a range and you have a competitor that has that range, that might just eliminate you right away. I have one of my clients doing some piece of equipment to measure the level of water in a lake, dam, and rivers, and those equipment are staying outside all winter long, and they need to be able to measure the level of water because it's very critical once the ice melt to know where is the water, the level of water, and what are the risks for the different regions. They had to adapt all their equipment and to change the component to make sure that the components were able to resist at -40 degrees. And we do reach those temperatures sometimes. So it's not just to make it difficult for you, it's because that's the reality of the country. There is I don't know if you remember on the map, but there is a province on the most eastern province in Canada named New Brunswick and Labrador, where the climate is very harsh. And basically, there are companies that go there to test all their equipment, especially for maritime application. Because basically what they're saying is that if you can resist the climate and the harsh condition of Newfoundland and Labrador, then your equipment will work anywhere in the world. So that's also maybe a nice place to test your equipment and to be ready for the worst. So government, I'm not going to go into too much details, but you have to understand that Canada is a constitutional monarchy, and that the Queen, or now the King of England, is also the King of Canada. And so even so, we have a Prime Minister, and in Canada we have a permanent representative of the British Crown, which is called the Gouverneur General, so General Governor. But in terms of politics, it doesn't really influence Canada, but it's there, and it's always a good thing to know. But I think I've covered most of what is in that slide. Yeah, no, one thing I think what, is always a shock for European people and European companies is that the third bullet in that slide. Montreal, for example, it's only 380 years old. Vancouver is only 136 years old. There are people who are almost that old in the world, and so it's very interesting to understand the history of the city and what to expect in terms of the development, and in your industry, the construction. Don't expect buildings that are 5,000 years old. There are none in Canada.
So we don't have the cultural heritage burdens in Canada to protect the culture or architectural patrimony.
Well, so actually, the very little we have, we're trying to protect it a lot. So anything that's over 100 years old, I'm telling you, people are protecting it a lot. And there are opportunities in that field, definitively, because they now realize that how important it is, how important it is for touristic activities. So a lot of money has been put in protecting the little heritage we have, but heritage it is.
Yeah, because in Europe, it impacts a lot renovation or reconstruction or relamping in terms of the lighting sector. If the buildings or areas are, let's say, protected by the cultural heritage laws. So this is very challenging for in Europe.
But in Quebec City, for example, in Montreal, Toronto to some extent, we do have more and more building under the Heritage Canada protection as well. And so that's really something that has changed. As I mentioned before, I arrived in Canada in 2003, but I was there before. And around 2005, we really saw a big change with a lot of construction in the older part of the city to protect it, to make it nice, and to keep the heritage building and protect them. That's been quite recent, but it is now really part of how we develop cities in Canada. So yeah, it's not as much as a burden that is in Europe, but there is more and more projects in that field. Sorry, is there, and thank you, Marta, for your question. I really appreciate. Anybody else has a question or comments? No, it's just Marta and I.
No, I think that when we will go inside the public procurement, there we will have some questions.
Okay. So economy and resources. So clearly, the economy in Canada is dominated by the private sector. Something that's quite interesting is how agriculture is organized in Canada, where we have, depending on the geography, as I mentioned before, we have the Manitoba and Saskatchewan, where it's a lot of agriculture, several agriculture, very, very large fields. But then when you come next to the city, that's where we do more of the animal proteins. And for example, Canada is the second largest exporter of porks in the world. So agriculture is a big part of the economy as well. We are very rich in everything related to mining, a lot of natural resources in Canada, mainly north, like I show you on the map before, that the population was concentrated along the US border, but most of the mine actually are up north, and a lot of development, like roads and so on, is done specifically to access those mines. A lot of hydroelectricity. I had that discussion yesterday with a company that provides services for the electrolyze industry, and a lot of projects in the world with all the tension you have, especially in Europe, on energy. A lot of projects are being looked at to be relocated in Canada, where we have the cheapest electricity in the world. So that's something to keep in mind, especially in the lighting industry. Even so, I understand you're more trying to reduce the use of energy, but here we have cheap and renewable electricity. This slide is very interesting, and maybe put in perspective the work to be done by European companies to develop in Canada. When you look at import and export sources, you can see that the US represents 75% of the export destination, and 64% of import, with for the import a big growing part coming from China. But I mean, you understand the huge role of the US, and I think for the companies that are either already in the US, please keep in mind that everything you're doing in the US can be leveraged in Canada. People will recognize your reference, your work you do in the US, in Canada, because the two markets are so connected. And the other way around, for a company that is at its first stage of approaching North America, Canada is a great way to learn how to work in North America, and then to be able to use those references and move into the US market. Going into the US market right away can be intimidating sometimes because of the size. Starting in Canada can be a good idea at a smaller scale, but a great way to understand how things works in North America. I'm just giving an example, but in the construction industry, for example, you want to, for example, I've worked with some company in the solar industry who were doing some racking system to put the solar panels on the roofing. And it was a company from Germany. They've done all the engineering based on some type of steel and type of gauge available in Europe. But then they came to Canada, and the type of steel and the type of gauge was not available, and therefore they had to redo all their engineering calculation. But now that once that was done, they were able to work all across North America and even to Mexico. So it's a good way to learn on a small scale with a low risk compared to the US, and then to deploy from there. And again, because it's so connected, I think it's always a good idea to look at the Canadian market this way. Antonella, I see that there is someone, Barbara Chavon, in the waiting room.
Yeah, I have me there. Thank you.
So now, free trade agreement. Canada has entered a lot of free trade agreements. 3 of them that are probably the most important for our discussion today. The first one, the CETA, which is the Canada-European Union Economic and Trade Agreement that was signed in September 2017, but has not been ratified by all the European countries or organizations yet. But even so, it's not fully ratified. It's in full use, and everybody is acting like it has been ratified by everybody. Then there is the CAN-UK TCA, which is just a copy-paste of CETA, but they had to change the name after Brexit. And then, sorry. And then there is a CUSMA. So I think we've all learned at school when we were young that there was a NAFTA between Mexico, the US, and Canada. And then Trump came, and Trump decided that NAFTA was not good anymore. So they renegotiated everything and they changed the name for CUSMA. But basically, CUSMA is just a Trump version of NAFTA. The CETA, I think what you have to understand from CETA are a couple of, I would say, three main things. Number one, under CETA, 98% of the goods are free of tax barrier. Sorry. Sorry, are free of tax duties, okay? So 98% of the good. The other thing you have to understand is that thanks to CETA, and that will be the subject of the day, as you know, thanks to CETA, Canadian companies can answer to any public tenders in Europe, and European companies can answer to any public tender in Canada. And the third thing that you want you to understand is that even if 98% of the goods are duty-free, even if we can answer the tender, there is still some barriers to the entry. And those barriers are not very advertised, but they are here. And it could be, for example, if you're working on an engineering project, you cannot have a European engineer signing a project in Canada. You will need to have either his equivalence, or he will need to have a local engineer that sign for him any documentation. If we look at lawyers, for example, lawyers, doctors, even if you're a lawyer, you've been a lawyer for 10, 15 years, or a doctor for 10, 15 years back in Europe, you come to Canada, you still need to pass some equivalency, or sometimes you're not even able to work here. So the barriers are in different places, but don't think because of CETA there is no barrier at all. There are some barriers everywhere, and one of them, which is actually clearly stated by the Canadian government and in some tenders, are to favor local content. Okay.
But is it this what you have just said in contrast to what was promised in CETA, in particular, if I'm not wrong, in the chapter 19, where is the Canadian government and also this federal government, but also the subcentral governments like provincials, they committed to treat the EU suppliers in open, transparent, and not discriminatory manner. So it's, you know, it's written there in CETA. And then the provision that you are quoting to prefer the local suppliers is in, let's say, slight contrast to this.
It is. It is, but the best answer, I guess, will be
they don't care.
No, but the best answer will be if they can demonstrate that there is more value. If you take two equivalent goods, and one of the good is made and provided here, How can you not agree on the fact that there is more value for the federal government to take some local supplier? If it's the same good, but then you bring more value for your territory, at the end of the day, it's a better answer to the tender. So I think that's how they do it. But at the same time, and Jonathan will cover that on Thursday, some tenders clearly state that they will favor local content and they're looking for local content. And I think that's a way to write it. It does not prevent you from answering. So even if it says local content preferred, any European company can still answer. But you have to understand that there is a risk that if there is an offer equivalent to yours, the local offer will be favored.
Yeah, so it's something like buy American, but in Canada, in this sense.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty fair statement. So here it's some information about the CETA, how it works. So trading goods, we've mentioned that. Rules of origin. So it's not because you assemble a product in Europe that it will be considered a European product. You will have to make sure you have a minimum content in Europe. So let's say you buy all your components in China, you assemble in Europe. It doesn't make your product a European product. You need to check on how the rules of origin have been established for your different products. Beyond the fact that the product are most of the products are duty-free, I think as important is the fact that the custom administrative work has been facilitated, and it's now fairly easy with the paperwork to bring products from one side to the other of the Atlantic. The regulatory cooperation, that's a big one. A lot of certification are recognized, but are not always sufficient, meaning that you can have a CE mark product. It will be recognized in terms of the quality of the certification, but you will still need to get the Canadian certification in some instances. So the Canadian body that's in charge of the certification will recognize that you already have a CE mark, for example, and therefore will accelerate the procedure. You don't have to restart from everything, but you will still need that Canadian certification, even if it's just, you know, taking the CE mark and tweaking it a little bit to make it Canadian, but you will still need the Canadian certification. But it will now be recognized in the process of getting the Canadian certification. Government procurement will talk about that a bit more. Labor mobility, that's quite important too. Immigration and we don't realize when we work with European how many constraints are actually on people who want to come to Canada when they're not from Europe. I just had recently 3 cases, a client coming from Argentina. For him to get his work visa, so just to come for 1 week to some meetings, the process is over 90 days. And then I had someone from Morocco and someone from China. In both cases, the process just to get a visa for 1 week is between 120 and 150 days. When you're in Europe, you wake up in the morning and you want to take a plane and come to Canada in the afternoon. If you do your AVE, ETA in English, sorry, you can, right? So that's, you know, one of the, it was always easier for European people, but now it's really easy for European citizens. So what that means is that if you have a project and you have to take care of the installation yourself, you can send a crew. You need to make sure they have the appropriate paperwork and they have the work permit and so on. But it is fairly easy. It is fairly easy. Investment, well, the CETA protect foreign investment, European investment, I should say. And typically the political climate in Canada makes it fairly easy to invest, and I wouldn't say fully risk-free, but risk very, very limited when you invest in Canada. And sustainable development is, well, like everywhere now, at the heart of what has to be taken into consideration when doing business there.